this part of the video, part 3, I am going to look at dyslexia. And I am going to look at it specifically in terms of how it affects modern languages and learning languages. So just bear that in mind. There are a lot of resources and support for children with dyslexia, just generally, and I will signpost some of those. So here's a sort of a summary of what dyslexia is from the Scottish Government's website about additional support for learners. And it's described as a continuum of difficulties in learning to read, write and or spell. And I think we can clearly see the links with learning another language. So if children have difficulties with their own language, then that is likely to translate into difficulties in learning another language. I think it's important to point out, as it says here, that it doesn't reflect their cognitive abilities. So just because they have dyslexia, it doesn't mean that they can't do things because they are not intelligent enough to do it. It just means that they have very specific difficulties with the language side of things. I think it's important to understand that. In terms of how dyslexia might impact a learner, okay, that will be very different from learner to learner. There isn't just, it's not the same profile for all children, as is so often the case with any additional needs. Children are individuals, but here are some of the things that they might find difficult, okay? So they might have difficulty processing language, and that might be auditory processing, so hearing it, and it might be visual, and it might be a combination of the two. So if you've already watched part 2, you'll see why it's so important to perhaps look at a different way of learning a language, like a kinesthetic approach to language learning, an active approach, because children with dyslexia might need that because they might not be able to deal with the visual or the auditory side of things. The phonics, phonological awareness. So as children, develop their language knowledge and are starting to read in another language, that may well be something that they struggle with because of their knowledge of phonics in their own language is something that they struggle with. And obviously it depends on the language. So something like French is not a phonetic language. In other words, what you hear is not what you write or you say. It doesn't look like what you say. So children will struggle with that because they can't just read it and pronounce it. They have to learn the pronunciation of the letters, of the letter sounds, and those sounds are different to English. Other languages are much more phonetic, take Spanish for instance, and so that makes it much easier to learn. Some languages like German sound much more similar to the English, and so some learners might find that easier. So just being aware that reading could be difficult. Oral language skills and reading fluency. So again, if a child is reading something in another language and they've got dyslexia, it might be quite stilted, and it doesn't mean that they don't know what they're doing. They're just having to take the time, taking them a wee bit longer. Some of these children might have short-term and working memory issues, so they can't hold a lot of information potentially. And then that will also affect sequencing, and it can affect number skills and their ability to organise. And therefore it can affect a whole range of things, not just within the modern language. But if they're having difficulty with sequencing and you're asking them to sequence things according to what they've heard, that actually might be doubly difficult for them. So it's just worth bearing that in mind. And children who have dyslexia do have to work a lot harder and get a lot more tired. So, bearing that in mind and thinking about how many tasks they do, what do they need to do? What's the core, and how do we help them? So these are some ideas. There's a paper here that you can read, specifically looking at dyslexia in modern languages. And so I've kind of drawn out some of the key points. Just because a child has dyslexia doesn't mean that they're not able in other areas of the curriculum. It might just be a linguistic issue that they've got. So that generally, they could be very creative individuals, even if they find spelling and reading difficult. So it might be worth using that as strength, and how can we play with that and work that to their advantage. So, they might, if they're trying to learn words, I might benefit from writing or drawing a picture rather than writing the word, creating a visual dictionary, or playing a Pictionary game and drawing a picture of it on a whiteboard rather than writing it to show their comprehension. I already mentioned that choice of language, that letter sound correspondence can be quite challenging with some languages. Actually physically teaching phonics in another language, quite often that will be missed, and it might be worth paying some attention to that, and how do we teach phonics in another language, and being aware of the different sounds. So there are different approaches. There's physical phonics, where there is a mime for different sounds, and I think they have 26 different phonic sounds that they work with and have a mime for, and you can buy a resource to support with that approach. The BBC has some phonics information on it at the Key Stage 2 French website, so that can be quite helpful. But just generally, when you are teaching it, especially as children go up through the school, teaching how letters sound, and when they are being introduced to the written word, matching it with the sound. TH in French is not th. TH is t. Te for a cup of tea. It's not th. My name is Thea. In French, it would be Thea. So showing that to the children. Using visual support, I've already talked about visual support, but making sure there are those displays with images and words to help them. Different colours can help, and some dyslexic children like certain colours more than other colours. So being aware of that and what helps them. Trying to organise grammar into patterns, whether that be different genders or whether it be common rules, how words end in plurals, what the exceptions are, and teaching it in the patterns. Being able to have cards that children can move around, so that physical approach might help with that ordering and sequential and matching things. Giving extra time. They do need more time to do things, just being aware how long it takes. And using digital tools. Does the child have to write, for instance? What are you focusing on here? If a child is learning something, is the focus on them saying the words, speaking the words, or is it on writing? And if it's on writing, are you wanting them to physically write it? Could they say it into a computer and get the computer to write it for them, so just thinking about what's going to work for that individual child. I put some examples here. For instance, if we're looking at vocabulary and grammar, using those ideas, what would that look like? So Lightbulb Languages has lots of lovely word mats, they call them, or knowledge organisers. So they can be useful as a reminder. They generally have pictures on them as well. So using colours, using diagrams, giving the translation so they've got the English, giving them the pronunciation of the words, and giving them a way of remembering that. So the word 5, sank, 5 people sank in a boat, helping them to remember that it sounds like the word sank. And as children get old enough, making sure they know that it's not spelt S-A-N-K like the English word, and showing them how it is spelt in French and making that clear. Some children and teachers find it easy to write that down, and making it clear though to children the actual spelling of the word and then how we pronounce the word. but the child might draw a picture of a boat for number 5 to help them, a boat sinking. And that might be a way for a dyslexic child. If they've got to give a presentation, they might write it out with pictures that remind them of that word. Okay. So quite different to writing out the actual words. Shapes, some children find shapes quite helpful. Lists, so they've actually got the words. And as I've already mentioned, patterns. So that's just, if you're looking at vocabulary and grammar, some ideas on what it would look like. General ideas for dyslexia can be accessed here. There's a toolkit for staff that are working with children with dyslexia. But if you do have children who have dyslexia, then a lot of the strategies you've put in place to help them with their English and literacy and their general reading, writing, listening and talking skills in their own mother tongue can be translated and used when they are teaching them another language. And again, I'd just like to point out that just because a child has dyslexia, it doesn't mean that they can't learn another language. They might just have to learn it in a slightly different way, or they might need a wee bit more support. But having dyslexia should not necessarily stop children learning another language. And we just need to provide the support to help them and be aware of their individual needs and what it is that they are struggling with. Is it the spelling of the words? Is it the reading of the words? Is it the amount of the work? What is it that they are finding tricky? So hopefully that gives you some things to think about.